and Magnolia, written by Laura Gehl and illustrated by Patricia Metola. I stumbled across this brand new book a couple of months ago at the amazing bookshop Santa Cruz. If you're ever in Santa Cruz, please go there. It is one of the most incredible larger scale independents I've seen in a good long time. This book is surprisingly personal to me. It's the very first time I have ever seen my name in a picture book, much less as the protagonist. Much less spelled correctly. Secondly, I was born in Washington State, a place known for apple orchards, and some of my very earliest memories are of my babysitters, Doris and Blanche, an elderly duo of sisters who had a wonderful little farmhouse with apple orchards all around it. I remember wandering the orchards and eating their homemade applesauce. I still got birthday cards from them pretty much until I went to college. And third, I was also incredibly close to my grandmother, just like the Britta in this book. I miss her a lot. Dang it, this book gives me all the feels. Before I get into the book itself, I want to talk about the illustration. I was not familiar with Patricia Metola's work before this book, and being willing to set aside local color for something much more fanciful. Local color, an apple tree and a magnolia tree would have green leaves and brown trunks. I think that Metola successfully adds a touch of the magical to a story that is about an ordinary girl and an ordinary garden. Isn't that the best possible way? So the Britta in this story has two trees in her yard, an apple tree and a magnolia tree, and she is sure that they are best friends. Her father nicely tells her that's not possible. Her oldest sister tells her not so nicely. But her Nana says unusual friendships can be the most powerful of all. One day, Britta starts to notice that Magnolia is in a bit of distress. And after a little prompting from her Nana, she starts to get to work on a massive scarf to better connect the two friends. It seems across time that the trees might actually be getting a little bit closer. Is that just her imagination? Just in case, she starts measuring every morning. And though her dad and her sister keep telling her, yeah, that's not really possible, that's not happening, Nana helps Britta make a chart to track the progress. The trees make it through the winter, but only apple starts to blossom. But Britta keeps on hoping. And finally, Magnolia's pink flowers burst into full bloom, just like Britta hoped they would. And while her dad and her sister both seem to think, nah, Britta, nothing you did really helped the situation, Nana once again affirms that unusual friendships can be the most powerful of all. This is such a great book on so many different levels. It is a celebration of nature taking care of nature, and of humans taking care of nature, of understanding that we are all one connected community, and acting like it. Laura Gehl, in an author's note at the beginning of the book, explains that scientists are just now exploring how connected plants might be to each other, that it seems entirely possible that they are communicating and helping each other. But it's also about holding fast to what you know and what is important to you, even in the face of both kind naysayers and bullies. It's about the importance of people who faithfully believe in you, who don't simply offer words of encouragement, although those are very important, but who also believe in you enough to assist you along the way, in as practical a way as they can. When I was a kid, my parents happened to hang plaques right outside my bedroom door, listing all of our names and the meaning of our names. So I was raised with an acute sense of how important names are. And Britta, at least as I was taught as a child, means strong heart. And that is exactly the kind of book that you see here. This is a book of strong heart. Laura Gehl, thank you for a wonderful book that just happened to be so personal to me. What a fun coincidence it was. And Patricia Metola, it is just gorgeous. The colors just sing. I absolutely love it. I think that the time is coming in which we're going to be able to measure, at least to a point, how much plants might be communicating with each other. So stay tuned. The picture is always bigger. The Impending Blindness of Billie Scott by Zoe Thorogood. Now an artist for Marvel/DC, Thorogood created this magazine-sized graphic novel at the age of 21. This is an incredibly impactful work from a young artist, about the nature of love, in some ways definitely about the nature of the body, and about the nature of human connection. There's so much packed into this one volume that it really blew my mind. I saw this on display at the transcendently great Books Are Magic in Brooklyn, New York. Both in visual style and in premise, I was hooked in about 20 seconds. And when I sat down to read the novel, it definitely exceeded my expectations. Billie Scott is a very young, pretty reclusive, single-minded artist living in the north of England who has just landed her first gallery show of 10 paintings when a random attack in the street leads to the eventual loss of her vision. She seeks medical help a few days too late. Her doctor tells her that she has only about 2 weeks of vision left. And finding out the awful news leads her to finally start to seek out the company of other people. Through the encouragement of her newfound friends in her building, she realizes that she needs to set out on a bit of a journey to find the 10 faces to paint for what she assumes must be her one and only art show. As she looks for these faces, she starts opening up to a lot of people in ways that she hasn't before, listening to their stories and sharing her own. I love that the details of this journey are kept within the marginalia of Billie's sketchbook. There's how many paintings she has left to go, how much of her tiny budget is left, Short status reports about the nature of her vision day to day, and meticulous notes about every subject she's drawn. Not just what she can see, but other things she's been able to learn about them. Billie starts to build community for herself, both because she needs the faces to draw, but also because she does verbally need to process what's happening to her. And she has such extraordinary social anxiety that appears to be a very new experience. She ends up in a shelter in London as Billie paints in a nearby alley every day. The lovely Rachel, a busker with a guitar who also walks through the alley every day, proves intriguing. As their friendship continues to grow, Rachel brings her back to where she lives, Funland, a junkyard camp full of houseless creatives. Billie gets closer and closer to her painting goal. She's still processing a lot of pain, and Rachel is trying to be there for her as she does. And the two grow together to become central to each other's creativity. Rachel encourages Billie that she will still make art, vision or no vision, because she is an artist, but also tells her that Billie is so much more than any one identity or activity, that she is loved because she is Billie, and no other reason is needed. I loved this whole novel. It's an unusually nuanced blend of brutality and gentleness. A story about opening up in your very worst moment to realize that something bigger and more beautiful and even happier is on the other side. That your world could be far more connected than you ever imagined. And that even if you didn't know that before, that was something you wanted all along. I also think that Thorogood does a really great job of balancing the tragedy of an artist suddenly losing their sight and the grief that accompanies that loss with a clear central acknowledgement that disabled people are not diminished persons, creatively or otherwise. And the soft-spoken depiction of queer love is deeply moving. I am really excited about Zoe Thorogood's work. In addition to her other hired projects, I hear that she has a second graphic novel of her own out. It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth. I'm currently on the lookout for it. In an interview with Fanbase Press, I saw that Thorogood had one art teacher in high school that stood out from all the rest. Instead of denigrating her silly cartoons like most of them had, this teacher both encouraged her and gave her exposure to ideas that gave her more of a concrete path. And I think that the impending blindness of Billie Scott is, in some ways, about the same things. Encouragement matters, in art and in life. Getting into the boat with someone matters, in life and in art. There's a myth that I personally have found very oppressive as an artist, of the ruggedly solo creative, who works in a vacuum far away from others, with little to no need for encouragement or guidance or community. It's just really toxic. And while our needs vary in that arena, everybody needs some kind of human connection. Billie finds her art in the faces of humanity. And yes, one really great little dog named Freddie. And even more so, she finds herself there. No matter how cornered you may feel by life, no matter how isolated you may have become, remember that yes, the picture is always bigger. Today we're going to talk about Dr. Seuss. An important disclaimer, I am a massive Seuss fan. I am one of the biggest Seuss fans you may ever find. There is no way I'm going to try to do a survey. In fact, I already realized as I was working on production this week that there's really 2 videos in here, not one. So Friday's video is going to be a bit more of a theory video about a certain aspect of Dr. Seuss's work. But today, I'm just going to tell you a bunch of weird fun facts about Seuss, some of which involve some of his more obscure titles. So here we go. Oh, the places we're about to go. I got a lot of this information, although not all of it, from this incredible biography, Dr. Seuss and Mr. Geisel, written by longtime friends Judith and Neil Morgan. I'm not sure it's currently in print, but when I looked it up today, it appears to have a lot of used copies around. Go find it. It's a freaking blast. I've read it several times and I always feel like I want to turn around and read it again. The man was fascinating. Ted Geisel, which is Dr. Seuss's real name, started his artistic career in advertising, eventually going into political cartooning, leading up to and during the Second World War. There's an incredible book, Dr. Seuss Goes to War, which I have on a bookshelf in a faraway city. It's a fascinating time capsule if you can get a hold of it. He published his first few books before the war began, taking a break between 1940 and 1947 for obvious reasons. And he began exclusively writing and illustrating his own picture books as soon as the war ended. Now, for my favorite random Dr. Seuss facts. 1. He felt extremely uncomfortable when he was actually around children. His wife Audrey Geisel said he was almost afraid of them. This, as you can imagine, made most of his public appearances rather excruciating. The only particular child that he liked very much was Teddy, his great-nephew, to whom the Grinch is dedicated. Granted, he also didn't seem to care too much for adults. Adults are obsolete children, and to hell with them. So we're not not sure who he liked. Number 2, possibly because of what I just said, he was incredibly prone to wander off and stage quiet pranks. Once, when he was supposed to be doing an event in a department store, they found him wandering around the shoe department changing the sizes on the ends of all the shoe boxes. Another time, he was busted writing fake autographs in the fronts of all the books in a hotel library. Genius prank. 3, he actually had an incredible knack for dirty stories and dirty poetry. I say dirty, but by today's standards, most of them were not that bad. They went pretty damn far into innuendo. This, in fact, is a reprint of one of his earliest books, The Seven Lady Godivas. There are, in this book, not 1, but 7, each one already engaged to one of the Peeping brothers. Yes, that is their proper name. And after their father dies having been thrown from a horse, the sisters take a vow to record a single page of horse truth before they can marry their respective peeper. Horse truth, incidentally, means common sense, like would use the term somebody has horse sense. That's the kind of term that Seuss was using in the 30s. What ensues are 7 stories, one for each of the ladies, in which they find a horse truth by working with actual horses and write it down on their page in the book and subsequently marry their peeper. The first Godiva only takes hours to marry. The last one, decades. If you're a Seuss fan, this is gold. And frankly, the quote-unquote nudity is not particularly graphic. The book was a total commercial failure, and Geisel was later quoted as saying he tried to draw the sexiest women he could, but they came out just ridiculous. He is not wrong. Meanwhile, he actually wrote a fair amount of mildly dirty poetry, a couple of examples of which can be found in Dr. Seuss and Mr. Geisel. The one about all the new colors you could suddenly use in the book printing process in the 60s, circa the Lorax or so, that's my favorite. Number 4, he and Bennett Cerf, a major author in his own right, who was Seuss's editor at Random House for decades and decades, were super good friends who really liked to mess with each other. In the back of the Lady Godivas, in fact, there's a bucket of sap labeled Bennett Cerf, because Seuss was sure Cerf was a total sap for publishing this stupid book. Meanwhile, Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham as a $50 bet with Cerf, who did not believe that Seuss could possibly write a book using only 50 very small early vocabulary words. It took flowcharts and maps and sleepless nights, but clearly Seuss did it. And until his dying day, he insisted that Bennett Cerf never paid up. And that kind of burn is priceless. Number 5, in what is arguably my favorite story about Dr. Seuss, which was perfectly relayed in Dr. Seuss's obituary in the Washington Post, written by legendary humorist Art Buchwald. Buchwald worked for the Washington Post for most of his career, and as he sat at home in 1974 watching the Watergate hearings, he remembered one of Seuss's more recent books, Marvin K. Mooney, and all of a sudden, Richard M. Nixon, will you please go now? So he called Seuss up and said, hey, do you mind if we run it with Nixon's name in it? Apparently he laughed and said, be my guest. An hour later, Seuss called him back and said, I ran it by the guys at Random House, and they hit the freaking ceiling. They said I can't take sides on Watergate. Buchwald asked him, so what do you want to do? He laughed again, be my guest. The time has come. The time has come. The time is now. Just go, go, go. I don't care how. You can go by foot. You can go by cow. Richard M. Nixon, will you please go now? If you wish, you may go by a lion's tail or stamp yourself and go by mail. Richard M. Nixon, don't you know? The time has come to go, go, go. Interesting personal coincidence. This was my absolute favorite Dr. Seuss book as a kid. My pediatrician had it in his office, and so my mom never bought it. She said I want her to have something to do while we're there. Smart mom. I bought it for myself in adulthood. Smart me. I could go on and on about all the other wacky things Dr. Seuss did and said in his lifetime, and I'd enjoy it. But again, I realized that I had enough material for 2 distinct videos. Today was all sorts of rando fun facts, and Friday is going to involve a few notes about Dr. Seuss's liberal progressivism, which for various reasons has been called into question. Because obviously, the picture is always bigger. Best Friends, written and illustrated by Steven Kellogg. I grew up in the 80s, and the great Steven Kellogg was enjoying a lot of commercial success at the time. He illustrated all sorts of books for other folks, but his catalog of author-illustrator titles is extensive, and I highly suggest that you check it out. There's a reason he was very well known for his renderings of tall tales like Paul Bunyan and Johnny Appleseed and Pecos Bill, which I love, because his illustrations are always, even for everyday subjects, a little bit larger than life. Like one of my favorite things that he illustrated that he did not write was The Day Jimmy's Boa Ate the Wash. There are not a lot of books written about massive boa constrictors for children, and his boa is both non-threatening and just absolutely delightful. I may have to go ahead and share that with you some other time. I like it so much. But Best Friends is a book that I remember reading from the library in the 80s, but I never had a chance to own it. I was able to procure this used copy only recently, and I was super stoked because it still had the Reading Rainbow tag on it. American kids from the 80s and 90s, you all know, LeVar was our guy, is our guy, always will be our guy. but you don't have to take my word for it. Again, I was just happy to find a good copy of this book at all, much less with the sticker. And lo and behold, this one is signed. No way! Geeking out! Kathy, the narrator of this book, has an amazing best friend named Louise. And they do absolutely everything together. They even share an imaginary horse named Golden Silverwind. And they use their matching magical witch hats to have all kinds of adventures, usually between their two houses. But tragedy strikes when Louise's aunt and uncle come and abscond with her to some sort of resort in the mountains for the whole summer. At first, Kathy tries to imagine how Louise could escape and the adventures they could get up to then. She even figures that Golden Silverwind may have to come to the rescue. Kathy finally gets a postcard. Louise is having the time of her life without her. Now Kathy starts imagining new things, like a volcano that will blow the mountain resort away, and perhaps a little bit of revenge in the face of Louise's eventual return. Kathy was really hoping that there was going to be a kid moving in across the street she could play with instead of Louise. But unfortunately, it's just an old man and a dog. And it turns out that Mr. Joad is not only super nice, but that Sarah, his dog, is expecting puppies. And when Kathy's mom says yes, she can keep a puppy, Kathy dreams about how she can keep the puppy from Louise as eternal punishment for her betrayal. Eventually, Louise's mom also asks Mr. Joad if she can have one of Sarah's puppies for Louise. This does not go over well with Kathy. Mr. Joad assures her there will be plenty of puppies to go around and that she can have the first spotted one. Louise does come back from the mountains at the end of the summer, and while Kathy tries to give her the cold shoulder for a minute or two, Louise has been thinking about her all summer and brought Kathy a bunch of presents that pretty much proves it. Time comes for Sarah to have her puppies, and lo and behold, the first one is not spotted, it's brown, so it goes to Louise. And Kathy thinks, no problem, there's gonna be lots more puppies. Well, it turns out that this time Sarah only had one, and Kathy feels awful. First, Louise gets to go off and have this great summer, and now she gets the only dog. It's not fair. But Louise has a great solution. I think we should name him Golden Silverwind, and he should belong to both of us. And they build him a doghouse in between Kathy and Louise's houses. And Kathy realizes that the next time Louise heads to the mountains for the summer, at least she gets to spend the whole time with Golden Silverwind all to herself. On first glance, this book is about a childhood friendship, and a lot of the emotions seem petty and immature. But guess what? Humans are always going to be human, and friendships are always going to be important to us. I've had a lot of adults talk to me about how friendship really isn't that important, as if friends are optional. I'm not going to buy it, because we all need connections, we all need love, we all need people to talk to. Some people may only require 1, 2, 3 friends. Some people require a lot of them. Some people like close ties, some people like loose ties, some people a mix of both. However you slice it, adults have friendships and they matter to us. And they can bring out a lot of these same feelings. How does my friend get ahead so easily and I don't? Why did they get to do that? Most adults I know play the comparison game extremely well, even if only in their own heads. And one thing I particularly like about what Kellogg does here, he acknowledges that friendships do have a selfish side. There is a part of us that needs something from the friendship. It isn't completely altruistic. And perhaps sometimes children are more honest about that than adults. And while that does mean that a friendship could be exploitative, good and healthy friendships simply recognize that both people need things. And the closer the friendship, often the more intricate those needs become. Sometimes they're totally different. Sometimes they're tangled up in each other. I can tell you, as somebody who has had some pretty big issues in friendships in my adult life, it hurts every bit as much as when you're a kid. It can be every bit as confusing, every bit as heartbreaking. And it also means that the healthy restoration of good friendships is really important too. It doesn't always have a happy ending like in this book, but we can try. So this is just a reminder, don't try to make do without friends. Don't try to explain away the hurt when your friends don't meet your expectations. Don't try to demonize your friends when they don't meet your expectations. That's really hard. I ain't perfect at that, but it's something we need to learn how to do. And finally, own your needs in your friendships. That is probably one of the biggest takeaways from this book. If Kathy had been much more willing to tell Louise, I'm feeling insecure, that might be a little harder for children to do, especially if they haven't been taught that. But as adults, we have that option. Here's to great friends. Mr. Kellogg, I doubt you're going to see this, but just in case you do, thank you for being such a great book friend. As a Reading Rainbow kid and beyond, I am forever your fan. And who knows? If I'm lucky, maybe I can still find my very own Golden Silverwind. The picture is always bigger. Today on Theory Friday, I want to talk about Dr. Seuss for the second time this week because I want to talk about his liberal progressivism, why it's been called into question, and what on earth that all might mean. There are many thinks to think here. First of all, I need to say this clearly at the outset. Dr. Seuss was a liberal progressive. I never would have guessed that I would ever have to defend that. Working in a children's section of a bookstore all last year, I fielded a lot of sarcastic, knowing comments from conservative customers. Oh, well, we know you can't sell Dr. Seuss anymore. As if I was supposed to be on the bandwagon that people were censoring or banning Dr. Seuss somehow. At that point in the conversation, I would make sure to absolutely gush. Oh no, we love Dr. Seuss. Behold all the Seuss that I have for you. Here's all of my favorites. Isn't he the best? Don't screw with me, Fox News. I see you coming. I think it's important to talk about this not only in the context of picture books, but in the life of all socio-political progressive movements. As a kid in the 1980s, raised by moderately conservative parents, who strangely enough became a bit more progressive over the last, 15 years. So weird. So proud. I can easily say that Dr. Seuss is my first gateway to liberal and progressive ideas. To the point that it actually shocked me by around age 9 or 10 that my parents and other parents more conservative than mine were handing these to their kids all over the place. An interesting tactic, Seuss. I'm here for it. The Lorax, about our environmental impact and obligations. The Sneetches, a story about the arbitrary nature of racism or classism or both. The Butter Battle Book, which I'm going to talk about with some other books in a different context next week, which informs children of the dangerous nonsense of nuclear arms. I mean, call it what you will, but this is not a particularly conservative agenda here. But last year, the company now in charge of Ted Geisel's estate decided to stop publishing 6 of his classic books, including this one, saying that these books, quote, portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong, end quote. Conservative media had a field day. Dr. Seuss has been cancelled! Censorship! Considering all of the book bans that have happened since that incident, the irony is too overwhelming for me to even countenance. Because of the misleading coverage coming from conservative news outlets, many people somehow thought that an external force had somehow abolished or banned these books, that they possibly were out to ban Seuss entirely, and that they were no longer going to be sold in stores. As far as I know, all existing copies were sold from shelves. I have not heard any reports of them being pulled from shelves, simply that they stopped publishing new copies. So there's 2 important facts about this situation that I would like to get into. First of all, a person or a person's estate after their death choosing to stop reproducing a piece of art because they feel it is offensive is not cancellation. Someone choosing to change their creative work or their trusted estate deciding that after their death does not amount to censorship. The people taking care of Ted Geisel's estate are the closest thing we have at this point to the man himself. During his own lifetime, actually, Dr. Seuss decided to change what he felt was an offensive page in his first book, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. He changed a certain racial slur to a Chinese man and took away the yellow pigment of that particular character's skin. That particular history indicates to me that Seuss would likely have done either what his estate did, i.e. stop publishing certain books, or had he been alive, perhaps he would have gone back and rewritten and re-illustrated certain pages in order to preserve the rest of the books. I don't believe that any of the books have pervasive representations throughout the whole story. Nonetheless, the images and words are often deeply problematic. I believe he would have been willing and eager to change any and all illustrations or text denigrating to people of African, Middle Eastern, or Asian descent. He was not a man that wanted to hurt people. He was a man who was intensely interested in healing the world. And I also do believe without his direct participation, particularly with his illustration style, you could have people make knockoff Seuss illustrations and try to fix these books. I don't think that's particularly feasible. I don't think the quality level would rise to the occasion, and we're not exactly sure what Seuss would have done in the form of correction. So without his presence, the only way they could attempt to repair the injuries caused by the racist and actually in one sense even ableist tones in these books was to cease the reproduction. The second fact that I want to talk about is the uncomfortable truth that progressivism is just that. It is a thing that progresses. We go from understanding to understanding. We seek to grow bigger and farther than we were before, personally and collectively. In Ted Geisel's day, a liberal progressive could acceptably say these things about people of color. Does that make it okay? Absolutely not. Even when he fixed Mulberry Street, he didn't go nearly far enough for what we know now is acceptable. As his fans, we have to own a dual reality that he didn't know better then, and that doesn't make it okay now, and never truly has. The first time I ever remember slamming into this kind of wall in intellectual history was when I read Mary Wollstonecraft in college. Wollstonecraft is often referred to as the mother of Western feminism, or one of the founding mothers of it. She also happens to be the mother of Frankenstein author Mary Shelley, who in my opinion opinion is much more interesting, yet I digress. Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. And if you read it cold today, devoid of context, it feels deeply offensive to a contemporary feminist position. There's a lot about women need to be educated in order to teach the children, and if we were educated, we could actually be companions to our husbands instead of just wives, whatever that means. She refers to a lot of uneducated women as silly, even as toys or spaniels. She does seem to imply that men are superior, at least in certain ways. For a young feminist, it's a lot to take in. I remember being very angry reading it. But now, if you have the information that she is arguing against women being property, which was still a common thought at the time, if you realize how new these arguments even were, it reads a little bit differently. It still can be very hard to stomach. But now that I understand her better, I do recognize that she took a lot of rather drastic steps out of the obligatory line of her day. She went up against some of the biggest intellectual voices of her time in order to fight for women's education, which perhaps she understood would lead to a lot of other important directions. She wanted to live in a world where men and women had respectful connections with each other. And even in writing in the way she did to the audience she addressed, she argued that women's voices need to be listened to, something I can take for granted, though not as much these days, thanks SCOTUS. It is often excruciatingly uncomfortable for progressives to look at our intellectual tradition with simultaneous self-honesty and self-acceptance, because that movement of growth inherent to our ideals means that we have come up short, usually very short, persistently and often in the past, and something in us knows that we are still doing it now, even as we are making our best efforts not to. So when non-progressives cry, "See hypocrisy!" we usually become sharply defensive, rather than sharing our history of change and how that concept works. That defensiveness also extends to groups that have been hurt, groups that have not only been hurt by others, but by us. We, white progressives in particular, have famously failed a lot of people, even in moments when we certainly knew better, or damn well should have. So we have two choices. Either we can get and stay defensive of a track record that is always mixed, or we can choose to work on it for the long haul. There's a famous, often misquoted statement from the great Maya Angelou that I believe succinctly sums up the call to progressivism. "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." In these two short sentences, she teaches us a way of being and a way of proceeding. I recognize that my past self had certain information and abilities. I acknowledge any incurred harm my more limited person inflicted. I now acknowledge that I indeed have new information that has expanded my awareness. And I promise to have the integrity to act accordingly, even as I will make mistakes on the learning curve. Shame and potential shame shall not sway my action. I personally find that at least as convicting as I do find it inspiring. And this is all Dr. Seuss's estate is trying to do. They are trying to stop reproducing injuries. It is an honor to Geisel's legacy, not a shaming of the name Seuss, to correct his mistakes. Knowledge or no knowledge, they were mistakes. In my favorite of his now retired books, On Beyond Zebra, Seuss spends a whole book creating new letters to expand our language beyond its existing reach. We need to admit that what we have said before is not something to automatically repeat, but that, in order to heal our world, or even to truly explore it, our words and the concepts behind them must grow. That definitely means leaving some things behind. Toward the end of that book, Seuss's character declares, "Finally, this is really great stuff. And I guess the old alphabet isn't enough. Remember that an alphabet of old is never enough. Remember that the picture is always bigger."